Firstly, I do have to thank Michael and thank the conference committee for inviting me to come, because it is really nice to be back in Edmonton after almost 5 years. And if you have only just come to Edmonton, get over to the other side of the river and go and explore. It's such a nice city. Don't just stay in this hotel. You might be wondering how this sort of fits. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit of a step change, I guess, in terms of what you've heard so far. But hopefully, my aim really with the talk is to just give you a number of things to reflect on. So even if you're not coaching young athletes, even if you're coaching older athletes, if you're not coaching at all, if you're working for an organization, hopefully the things I talk about will be things that you can take home and really think about. So what I'm going to talk about is the parent-coach relationship. And I will be very honest when I start now by saying I am unashamedly biased towards parents. So I put that out there first and foremost because I think parents get a really bad rap. I'm not a parent. I have lots of friends who are parents, and I think that parents really, it's a really tough gig, and I think being the parent of an athlete is an incredibly tough thing. Being a parent of an athlete who's going to have to succeed across a number of sports, so within triathlon, they're going to have to be getting to swimming and to running and to cycling and you know, all of these scheduling things. I think it's tough. But what I want to sort of argue or present to you today is really how you can work with parents and how we can make sure that people are getting the most out of the experience. So firstly, I'm actually going to draw on a little bit of the comments that Jean made earlier around sort of the role of parents across the lifespan, and hopefully you'll see how even if you only work with adult athletes, you really do need to be thinking about maybe how their parents are influencing their engagement. Then I'm going to talk about how parents can be optimally involved in sport. So we do know what parents can be doing. We know how they can get the best out of their athletes, and particularly in reference to the things that Nick talked about in terms of motivation. Nick mentioned that he thinks motivation is the biggest thing to impact on performance. I think parents are the biggest thing to impact on performance, because from the moment you're born, what your parents say to you, you take on board. And so they hugely impact on motivation. Then I'm going to kind of pass it over to the coaches and answer some of the so what questions. So as a coach, what could you be doing and what should you be doing? And then very quickly, my time has gone down since I started the talk, but we will hopefully get into a few strategies that you can take away straight away. So I guess the first thing, and just to sort of situate things a little bit, the first thing is really to just position this work in understanding a few of the points that I made right at the beginning about why we care about parents. So we don't exist in isolation. We don't parent in isolation. We don't coach in isolation. We're not an athlete in isolation. Sport is complicated. And we increasingly know that the social relationships that people develop within and through sport really do impact on every aspect of development and performance. And when we start to think about parenting, we have to understand it within this complex social environment. Fundamentally, because without the people and without parents particularly, sport wouldn't happen. Right? You wouldn't have athletes to coach. You wouldn't have athletes in your organizations if the parents didn't sign them up and if they didn't bring them to training. So you really do have to start to think about parents, but you need to think about them within a kind of a broader context. So when we look at the research, and I'm very much guided by the work that Jean does around the different phases that he showed the model a number of times earlier on. When we look at kind of crudely allocating the roles of parents across these stages, we know during that sampling stage, so during those early phases, where maybe your athletes aren't specializing in triathlon, rather they're doing all sorts of different sports and they're gaining a solid foundation, parents are absolutely key there. Everything that parents say is impacting on the kids. The parents are getting them to competitions. They're getting them, hopefully they're not competing too much. They're getting them to training. They're instilling enjoyment, and they're really developing perceptions of competence. So we know that what parents are saying when their kids are young are really pushing up perceptions of competence. And if you hopefully were just listening to what Nick said, we know that competence is a really key element. We also know that at this younger age, the things that parents are saying to their kids gets internalized. So if you're not getting an athlete until they're maybe 16, 17, 18,
you've got to hope. There was a question earlier around what do coaches want? What do they want the development coaches to do? You really, really want your development coaches to be developing good relationships with parents, because when they get to you, if you get them when they're 18, all of the things that the parents have said up till then, all of that will have been internalized, and it doesn't disappear. So there's a perception that coaches become more important as athletes get older, and that's absolutely true, right? Absolutely. As athletes get older, what coaches are saying becomes more important, but what parents have said remains. Okay, so we really want that early kind of involvement from parents to be right. As children are starting to specialize, so as they're deciding what sports they want to do, as they're deciding that maybe they want to push forward with a career, parents are really important here, but so is the coach. And this is where we start to see some conflict. Coaches think that they maybe have the right thoughts and the best ideas, and parents think that they have the right thoughts and the best ideas, and we know this is a really tricky time. Unfortunately, I think how a lot of coaches deal with that is really just to push parents away. It's much easier to not have to deal with parents. It's absolutely the worst thing you can possibly do, and I will hopefully make an argument for that as we go through. But Vicky mentioned that I do work around safeguarding. So I do work around making sure that kids are safe in sports. And as soon as you ban a parent, you better be 100% confident as a coach that you know what you're doing. Because you have now taken the one person out of the equation who could look out for a kid at all times. So that's sort of my little shout out for around safeguarding kids. But as soon as you don't involve parents, now it's on you. You need to know what to do when the kid is injured, if they fall off their bike and they're concussed, if there's inappropriate relationships. Like, now this is all on you as soon as you don't involve parents. Then when we move into the investment stage, so when we move into the stage where that's it, the athlete's decided, I'm going to be a triathlete, this is what I'm committing my career to, parents don't go out the picture. Parents are often still providing that financial support, and as we know, money is very important within that transition into kind of making your own money as an athlete. So parents are going to still have an opinion, they're still going to have things to say, but parents are still going to be the most important emotional support for an athlete. So when things go wrong, so I was thinking with Nick's story, you know, I'm sure in those situations there were still phone calls to mum. There's still phone calls to dad, still trying to figure it out. So we know throughout the lifespan, parents really are pretty critical. When parents get it right, when they're doing all of the things that we would want them to do, and I'll talk about what those are, it has really, 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 really good consequences. We know that there's parents who are doing a great job, and Malcolm actually mentioned to me yesterday about, you know, looking at the Brownlee brothers and the family support that they've had, and how, you know, those parents really do seem to have it dialed in. When it's right, it's right. But the issues come when it's not right. The issues come when the parents maybe don't understand the performance context, maybe when the parents are struggling with their own demands, when there's challenges that they're facing. When, as coaches, perhaps there's too many demands being put on the athletes. But we know within triathlon, or at least I know in Wales within triathlon, where the parents are really struggling is around how to piece the training programs together. So the majority of athletes at the younger ages are not in a triathlon program, they're in a swimming program, and they're in a track program, and they're in a cycling program, and the parents are just absolutely maxing these kids out. So from a sort of a safeguarding perspective, we know that that's where a lot of the issues are coming. So we've got a lot of athletes whose parents are, I think, for all intents and purposes, trying to do the right thing, but they're overtraining their kids. So we know that there's some issues. And as coaches, you can really help to address those issues, and I'll show you how in a little bit. So my first take home, I guess, and it's not a complicated take home. My first comment really is just, you have to first and foremost recognize that parents are going to be in the picture, and parents are going to be having an impact on athletes. Okay, so firstly, if you don't acknowledge that, you're going to have problems forevermore. You have to acknowledge that whether you want them around or you don't, that they're going to be there. So how do we want parents to be involved? So when I was studying here at the U of A, I did my whole PhD looking at parents' involvement in sport, and
one of the things that we developed was this theory around optimal parental involvement. It's not a theory that parents know about, because why would they? It sits in the scientific literature. But it's something that I hope that more and more coaches can start to appreciate, because if you know what you're trying to get out of your parents, if we know how parents can best support their kids, then we can start to take steps to make sure that they're involved in the best possible ways. That's as complicated as my slides get. And really all it is 3 boxes linked together with a few other boxes, and I'm going to break those boxes down now. I don't do the graphs. I think we've had some graphs earlier. You won't see any of those from me. So the first thing, and this might seem so simple, but it's really not, is that parents and athletes have to be on the same page. Whether that's when you're 6 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, 20 years old, if a parent's part of the sporting journey, parents and kids have to be on the same page. So if you think about it, you assume that athletes want to be the best they possibly can, and parents want their kids to be the best they possibly can. But it's not always that simple. And I get really frustrated because we, as sports psychologists, as coaches, we hear things like, oh, parents should just say to kids, did you enjoy it? They absolutely shouldn't say, did you enjoy it? If the athlete has been training for a year, 4 years, it's the Olympics, they haven't medaled, that athlete does not want you to say, did you enjoy it? So these flippant kind of statements, these sort of directives of what parents should say, fundamentally disregard this idea of understanding why athletes are involved. So if you have an athlete who is trying to be an Olympian, you want the parent to be on the same journey too. And often you assume that parents want their kids to be an Olympian, right? If their kid wants to be an Olympian. But often parents aren't ready for it. They don't know what they're sort of wanting their kids to do. So I guess the easiest thing, the sort of the take home for me around this is, have you ever sat down, if you're a coach, have you ever sat down with a parent and an athlete and tried to work out if they're on the same page? Have you ever actually asked your athletes to really, truly reflect what they value as an athlete, what they're trying to achieve, and then had that conversation with a parent? Parents haven't done it. They haven't done it on their own. And one of the things that I like to do when I work with parents, particularly if there's couples in the room, ask them why their kids are involved in sport. Then get ready for some conflict management, because usually mums and dads are involved for different reasons. Parents will say that they're involved because they want their kids to develop, I don't know, physical skills. They want them to be healthy. They want them to be gaining all the sorts of life skills that we know you can get from sport. Then you ask them how they would react if their child wasn't successful, or they weren't selected, or they got injured and they could never race again. And you see the reaction, and you know that they absolutely were not hoping that their child would just develop physical skills. Okay, so you have to present scenarios, and you have to present situations to parents, and you have to present those same scenarios and situations to athletes, and then you can start to get to the root of, like, why are you actually involved? And if you can get there and you can make sure that parents and athletes are on the same page, now you can start working well together. But the one thing you have to be aware of is there's all sorts of, in the UK right now, the sexy phrases, there's all sorts of bumps in the road. There's transitions, right? Things happen, school happens, injuries happen, relationships happen, all sorts of things happen. And as all those things are happening, the reasons that athletes are involved and the reasons that parents are involved will change. And that might be something from, I don't know, parents getting divorced and suddenly they want different things for their kids, you know, to a kids getting in a relationship and now they want something different from sport, right? So you have to anticipate, when are these bumps going to happen? When are these transitions going to happen? And make sure you have a conversation right around then to make sure they're staying on the same page. So firstly, get that in place. And then this one's a little bit more complicated. Once you've got that, once you know why parents and athletes are involved, then you really want to help parents to develop what we call an understanding emotional climate. It's not as complicated as it sounds. Basically, you want parents to show that they understand their kid, that they understand the sport, and that they understand what the sport means to the athlete. Often, and I have this a lot because I work with quite a few parents,
It's really hard to understand your child, particularly during adolescence when there's all sorts of crazy things going on. So I guess the only thing you can do is understand that there's all sorts of crazy things going on and the brain is changing and hormones are changing, and try and talk, right? Just try and talk, encourage athletes to reflect, encourage them to understand themselves, and then share that information with parents. Because if there's one thing that I would love to see more of between parents and children, it's communication. I'm not saying that's easy, but that's really what's needed to develop this sort of climate. Then the other thing, and this is where coaches become really important, is parents have to understand the sport. Parents absolutely have to understand triathlon if they are going to support triathletes. They have to understand every step. They have to understand why you're doing different types of training. They have to understand, once you progress from here, you might go to here. This is why we do this many competitions. I'm not saying they have to understand all the things that we've discussed here today, but they have to understand the sport that their child's in. Because we sort of make an assumption that people work that out. That I grew up playing tennis, and it's sort of assumed that my parents understood tennis. They had absolutely no idea what tennis was or how you did this or why this would happen. And when we start to think about your elite athletes, parents don't know how the Olympics go. Parents don't know how, the world championships go. They don't understand, well, where can I stand and what should I say and can I even go? Right? Why would they understand that? They've never done it. But as coaches, you've been through that situation. And so if you can give that information to parents, now parents, we say knowledge is power, right? And that scares coaches because they go, oh, we'd really like them to know less, because if they know less, they will say less. No, they'll absolutely still say the same amount of things, but they might not say the right things. Okay, so if you give them some information, then you can help them to really say the right things. And then the other thing around understanding what the sport means to the athlete, that's really in relation to understanding that whilst an athlete might be involved in the sport because they want to be an elite athlete, because they want to become a professional, all of the different, kind of lofty goals that athletes might have, they might also be involved because there's other things, right? And they can gain all these different benefits. And if we can help parents to understand that, your kid might not make it, they might keep coming fourth, but they're getting all of these different experiences, that would be really, really useful. And, I like to use myself as an example when I talk to parents around this. So I grew up playing tennis. I traveled every single weekend. I was never going to be an elite athlete. But I went to the States and I played college tennis, and then I quit because I thought this was a terrible idea and I'd go into academia instead. But then I got the LTA, who organise tennis in the UK. They paid for my master's. And then I came over to the U of A and I played tennis, and my research is in tennis, and I have connections all through tennis. And that's simply from playing a sport, right? So when you start to get parents to realize there's all these different benefits, then they again can develop this much more understanding kind of stance towards their children. And then there's competitions. Now, obviously triathlon's a little different to a lot of the sports in the sense of where parents can be located and where different parts of sort of events are happening. But competitions, for me, don't just mean when the athlete's out competing. It's that period before a competition, during a competition, and after a competition. That's a very small amount of a parent's influence. They have huge influence at home and at training, but in that emotionally charged environment of a competition, that's where it can kind of go wrong. That's where parents really struggle with their own emotions. It's where the conversations can be really, really tough. I talk to athletes a lot in my research, and they laugh when you ask them, what would you like your parents to do around competitions? Because they basically say, whatever they do, it's going to be wrong, unless I win, and then everything's fine. So firstly, I think parents need to sort of know that, right? They need to know that you're probably going to get it wrong, but if you're doing it with the best intentions and you apologize if you realize you've kind of messed up, that's going to be a good start. But then the easiest thing to do is talk to an athlete. Like, talk to them. How many times, and it comes back to my previous question, how many times do you give an opportunity for your parents and athletes to talk about what they want at competitions. You could flip this also, right? Have you had the conversation as a coach? What does the athlete want from you before, during, and after a competition? But from a parent, it becomes really, really important. And there is research now looking at kind of the impact of family at like the Olympic Games and really high-level events. And what it's showing is there has to be rules, right? There has to be rules around when you communicate and when you engage. And it all comes down to this same idea of parents have to know what's expected for them, because otherwise they're going to get it wrong. And they're probably going to get it wrong anyway, but let's give them something to help along the way. So that's what we want from parents. And if you work on that, if you make time, and I know that time is precious, and I know you need to get your athletes out training, and I know the last thing that you want to do is spend time talking to parents. I appreciate all of those things. But if you spend the time up front, it's going to have such a positive impact on your working life going forward, but also on the lives of your athletes. So if you understand what we're trying to achieve from parents, if we understand what makes a good parent or the best kind of involvement from parents, that's going to help. And what can you do? I think that there's 3 roles of a coach in developing parent-coach relationships and enhancing the involvement of parents. The first one is understanding parents. It does go both ways. Parents also need to understand coaches. The reason I got interested in researching parents was I realized that it was horrible for my parents that I grew up playing sport, that it was like incredibly stressful. My mum never watched me play. She used to sit at home waiting for the phone to ring, and she thinks the development of a mobile phone was the best thing because she knew if the phone rang, I'd won, and if she got a text, I'd lost, and that made the whole thing substantially easier. But then I started researching what it's like for parents. And this is why I say I'm a bit of a parent advocate. After my first study asking parents what it's like having an elite athlete as a child, I just picked up the phone and I was just apologizing to my parents. Like the stories that I was hearing from these parents were traumatic. There's sobbing, there's divorce, there's affairs, there's bankruptcy, there's kids being neglected, like just these traumatic situations for parents. And I'm not saying that's what it's like for all parents, but it's tough. It's expensive and it's emotionally demanding. And logistically, it's just really, really challenging. And especially if you're trying to get here, there, and everywhere, you've got governing bodies who usually are really bad at communicating or potentially not that organized. You've got coaches who maybe don't really want to engage with you or aren't explaining things. And then you have the whole parenting part, right? So you've got the sport demands, and then you've got all this parenting stuff that you have to do. Like, you have to raise a good kid. You have to have someone who might succeed in the future if they're not an athlete. You have to decide how long do we keep them in school? Do we pull them from school? Do we move to somewhere near a training center? Like, all of these decisions, parents are kind of grappling with on a daily basis. So if you want to have a good relationship with parents, you just need to understand that, right? They might freak out at you, but it's nothing to do with that comment you made. It's because they rushed out of work, they didn't finish what they needed to do, they didn't apply for a promotion because they knew that would mean they would have less time with their kid, they haven't had any holidays for years and years because they have no money because they've spent it all on sport, and they really rushed to get their child to training on time because they knew you'd shout at their kid if they were late. And then you said something and they lost it, right? So there's a lot going on for parents. I appreciate there's a lot going on for coaches too. So my suggestion, try and understand each other. Try and make some time to talk. And just, we talking about athletes as people. Let's talk about parents as people, right? I'm sure a number of you are parents in this room, and I think that you probably have a life that extends a little bit beyond your kids, right? So let's think about that. Then you need to support parents. And again, I appreciate I'm looking at this one direction at the moment. I will flip it back in a moment. But, one of the simplest things you can do, and I sort of mentioned it before, is talk to parents and help them understand the emotions they might experience. As coaches, when you see your athletes performing, you know how you feel, right? So potentially you get a little excited leading up to a competition. You stay calm, though, because you don't want to put your athletes off. When you're seeing sort of the splits, or you're seeing how they're doing in different, in the transitions, you know how you feel. Now just multiply that quite a lot by the fact that this is now a parent of a kid, and you can give them some insights. As soon as you know what you're going to anticipate, you're going to be better prepared. Okay, so talk them through what's it like at competitions. If you really want to commit to this, which I would love you all to do, you can role play different situations, right? So we do it a lot with parents. All right, so today your kid lost, or they got injured, or they got a puncture, or they were winning right until the last couple of minutes and then suddenly they were overtaken, or it looked like they were going to drown in the swim, like all sorts of scenarios, and you just give them, okay, how do you think you'd feel? How will you respond? What are you going to do? Playing out these sort of scenarios is really helpful for parents. You can use those same scenarios with your athletes. You can actually do it in the same room, right? So, all right, this is the scenario. This is, what's going on. How do you think you'll respond? What emotions will you feel? Okay, how might your parent sort of respond in that situation? Do give parents some guidance, okay? So one of the things that I've learned, so I used to be very anti telling parents what to do. I actually don't like the idea of telling a parent how to parent. But the more I talk to parents, the more they tell me that they just don't know what to say, right? So if you know that you've been focusing on something specific, or you know that going into this race, the time for the run was the most important thing, that's what you'd been working on. If you say that to a parent, if you give them a little bit of information, then they can respond with some degree of appropriateness, right? So they can now have a conversation that maybe you would want them to have, as opposed to just, some random sort of discussion. So giving that guidance can be really, really helpful. Again, as a coach, I'm sure that you've developed strategies that help you manage your emotions, right? That help you manage some of the challenging situations. That information can be really helpful for parents. So one of the things that we do is we give parents suggestions just around breathing techniques, or self-talk, or listening to music, or staying away from other people if they frustrate you, right? So you can discuss sort of strategies that will help parents, and then again, they'll be able to better engage with the audience that they're with. And then the last one, and this one's a bit tougher, but this is about reappraising competitive situations. So for parents, generally, every competition is the most important competition because it's the one that's happening right now. For athletes and for coaches, it's usually not like that, right? You normally have some sort of plan around which events you're going to focus on the most and what you're trying to get out of different events. Helping parents to understand that and helping parents to sort of reappraise the situation and get some understanding of what's going on can, again, really help them to be able to be better involved in their kids' lives. And then thirdly, and I've sort of alluded to this all the way along, you absolutely have to work with parents. You do not deal with parents. You do not manage parents. You work with parents. They're assets. They know the athlete better than you'll know them. They know, especially when they're younger, they know how they're doing at school. They know when they got up. They know if they've eaten well. They have information that's going to be really, really helpful for you. They will know if at the weekend they were out with their friends for 5 hours running around, and that might impact on how they're going to train. Parents have information, and if you work with them and you develop a relationship where they feel they can share that information with you, then you're going to be in a better situation. But it doesn't all have to be on you. Parents really respond well to other parents. And I don't know what the scene is like in triathlon, but in a lot of the sports that I work in, there's real cliques between parents, especially if you're the parent of like the good kid. You don't tend to hang out with the parent of the not so good kid. I don't know why. It seems like high school, but it seems to happen quite a lot. And so one of the things you can really do is try and encourage parents to spend time together. They don't have to be friends, but having a bit of a parent support network, having somewhere that they can kind of discuss getting to competitions and sort of sharing lifts and having some social events to get rid of some of that competition is really, really helpful, especially early on in a season. And then this one is sort of around culture change. So
I think a lot of the issues that we have with parents comes from the fact that the sporting environment is really tough. And it is training straight from school, which is usually when parents are working. It is training on the weekends when parents are exhausted and they want to have some time. It's swimming, I guess it's the same everywhere, in the middle of the night, right? Like 5 o'clock when, so it's tough. And I'm not saying that you can change all of these things like that, but have a think. What are you doing within your clubs, within your organizations that are making things harder for parents? Is it possible that training starts at 5 rather than 4? Is it possible it starts at 5:30 rather than 5? These little changes, and I appreciate I've made that sound simple and it's not, but these little changes that just make life a little bit easier really will help you to develop stronger relationships. So I would contend, and I think the research supports me on this, that if you work with parents, if you develop strong relationships with parents, they will be better involved. And your life will be easier. I promise you that. I shouldn't do that. I hope that your life will be easier. It generally is. But I also appreciate that it's tough to work with parents. I did some research. So this is tennis coaches. And I talked to them to find out the issues that they have with parents. I've never had such long interviews. These interviews went on and on and on and on and on. And what it really boiled down to is that parents have no idea what you're trying to do as a coach, right? So they're phoning you on the weekends, and they're texting you, and they're calling you out on Facebook, seems to be the thing in the UK at the minute. And they're really quite demanding. I do 100% appreciate that. And that's where, for me, it comes down to communication. When things are demanding, our natural instinct is to just stay away from it. But if you run into this one head first, if you just go at it and you communicate and you make sure that parents realize there's some rules, right? So really easy rule is the 48-hour rule. If you're annoyed at me for something, you cannot address it within the first 24 hours. You have to have addressed it within the 48 hours, otherwise it's done. You can communicate with me in these modes, but no other modes. But then you can't break it. So if you don't want them texting you, you can't text them. Right? So you have to think these things through a little bit. But if you give them more information, if you give them things that they can do, if you give them tasks, if you give them strategies, you will find that some of these challenges that you get from parents really will get easier. So there's loads of these are really straightforward sort of tips. Nick talked about goal setting. I would always encourage that parents are involved in those conversations, not necessarily during the goal-setting process, but definitely after, so they understand those goals, they understand why they were set. Monthly meetings or scheduled meetings. Discuss philosophies. I know we've got a few development coaches in the room. If you're a development coach, are you a true development coach focused on technical and tactical kind of performance, or are you a development performance coach where really you're interested in winning? Right? Because these things are slightly different, and parents sign kids up with a perception of what a coach is going to be like. So thinking about your philosophy, thinking about what you're trying to achieve, and then articulating that to parents is really important, because it's okay for a parent to go, this isn't what I want from my kid. Right? We might talk about the fact that we don't want parents focused on winning all the time, but if you have a parent who's focused on winning all the time, they probably can find a coach who's also focused on winning all the time. Right? There'll be other people that you can talk to. Online forums, discussions, if these are moderated well, that can work really, really well, giving parents an opportunity to speak. But you want them to be closed groups. You absolutely don't want them to be just open public conversations. And when I say moderated well, I would generally say, as a coach, let parents know that you're going to see what they say, because you don't want them to become just sort of slanderous conversations. Sending out notices, sending out newsletters. In the UK, our Modern Pentathlon, the National Organisation for Modern Pentathlon, the head guy there, he sends out a letter to a parent. He chooses one parent every week, and he handwrites them a letter. And every week he sends out his schedule.
and he sends out all the information of what's going on, and they have phenomenal relationships with their parents, right? So the more open and the more transparent you are, the easier it is with the parents. And then provide opportunities for athletes to communicate with parents. You might assume that that stuff's happening at home, but if you provide the opportunities within an environment you're comfortable in, you can also be part of that conversation, but we can go all the way back to what I said about making sure parents and kids are on the, parents and athletes are on the same page. Other things that we've sort of discussed a lot around support networks and coping strategies, making time for social events, which is often what the coach wants to do the least. But if you do it, just do it early in the season when you don't all hate each other. And then you can really set the tone for the rest of the season. And be creative. Be creative. What's going to work for you? What's going to work for your athletes? What's going to work for the people that you're engaged with? And commit to it. You can't just do it. You can't go, I'm going to work with parents. I did one meeting and now we're done. Right? That's not going to work either. Now you've set an expectation, so you need to sort of follow through with it. And hopefully, we'll see better relationships between parents and coaches, and we will definitely be in a situation where parents are able to engage with their athletes better, and the athletes will be able to perform better. And that's my final take home. So you can breathe a sigh of relief because it's been a long day. And my final take home messages. So we've all done very well because we were told to give take home messages. Parents are a part of the journey. They can positively influence it if they're involved in the right way. Hopefully from this presentation, you've got an idea of what the right way might entail and how you could maybe adapt that within your environment. As a coach, if you can understand that and you can support parents in doing that, and you can put a few small steps in place to work with parents, then hopefully you'll be in a position where we have this, in my mind, a utopia where everyone gets on really well and everyone's succeeding. So with that, I will stop. And thank you all for listening and indulging me while I talked about my very favorite topic. And I think we have 1 minute, 35 seconds for questions.
Yes.
Firstly, thanks for taking the slot as presenting last in the day. I know it's a hard gig, but I think you had everyone's attention. Questions I've got is related to coaching and whether it's your personal advice or what you've discovered over the time. Coaches who don't have children and how that impacts in dealing with parents who are obviously, for someone like myself, I don't have children. I'm often told that, what would I know, I don't have children, but I've probably worked with 20, 16 and 17-year-old girls over 12 years, and I sometimes wonder what they know about their children. But just a little bit of insight into what you've found and your advice on that.
So it's actually a concern I have, right? So I spend a lot of time working with parents, and I'm not a parent. And I do appreciate parents bring that line out. So two things, not directly addressing your question, the first one. The first one is not to be defensive when that comes up. It feels like they're accusing you of not knowing something, right? And so straight away it can put you on the defensive of, well, what do you mean, what I don't know? So first thing is just recognize that they're probably venting about something entirely different and just let that one lie. And then the other one is I would just say, I'd be very honest about it. So what I've found in my experience is that, the coaches who don't have kids, just be upfront about that when you're first talking to parents. Indicate that you want to learn about their child, but give them all of the information that you do know, right? So you've just told me the stats of kind of who you've worked with, and give that understanding, but recognize that they are the expert in their child. Even if you question that, just let them think it, even if you just let them think it. So let them think that they're the experts, because they probably are, and then try and work together from a place of we're both working as a team to get the best for the child.
Is it a barrier for coaches, from your experience?
I don't think it's a barrier. I think that it's a potential challenge that you just have to address, right? So where I work right now, there's a big criticism of the coaches because they're very young and they don't get it. Like, I'll be honest, but that's an age thing as opposed to a having kids thing.
So I think, as soon as you show willing to understand what it's like to be a parent, and some of those things I talked about there around, having an appreciation for the challenges, I think then straight away you get the parents on your side. So one simple thing, and then I'll stop because this is flashing. In those reviews I talked around with the parents and the coaches, I said to the coach, they had a really argumentative parent come in, and they didn't know what to do, and the parent left, and I happened to be in the room. And I said, just for fun, just out of interest, in the next one, start the review by thanking the parents for everything they do. The parents were totally confused by this, and it was the smoothest review that you could see, because it gave an indication that you were understanding their experience. And so for me, if you don't have children, maybe you have to work slightly harder to demonstrate that you're trying to understand it, but it shouldn't be a barrier if you recognize that.
Camilla, thank you very much. So thank you again for your attention to the last two speakers.